Okay, we are live, ready to go. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch. I am the Director of Public Programs for the Polis Project, and today we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Khary Polk. Dr. Polk is Associate Professor of Black Studies and Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies at Amherst University, and author of the book that we're going to be discussing today, Contagions of Empire, Scientific Racism, Sexuality, and Black Military Workers Abroad. 1898 to 1948. Out now from the University of North Carolina Press. Khary Polk, welcome to the Polis Project Book Salon.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and this in fact is my actual book launch. So thank you so much. Thinking about how to do this in a COVID moment has been challenging, but also really fascinating and intriguing in terms of how we are using media, or how I'm using media in new ways. So it's really nice to be here.
Fantastic. Before we begin, just a brief note to our audience. Part of the goal here is to simulate an actual book event, which means that to the extent possible, we're going to try to make this an interactive event with our audience. So if you're out there and you're watching and you have a question for Dr. Polk, please send it along to the Polis Project Twitter account, which you can find at project_Polis, and we'll ask it if there is time permitting. But without further ado, I want to make the most of our time. So let's just jump right in. I wanted to start by laying the conceptual foundations for talking about the book. As the title suggests, you're interested in understanding the role of Black labor in service to American militarism and empire from the end of the 19th century through roughly the first half of the 20th century. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of employing the term military workers, which is in the subtitle, for your study, and the ways in which it gestures to the hierarchies of power in American society and in the American military?
Definitely. I think that this was a term that came out of my research, and in some ways came out of the archival conversations. Oh, excuse me. My phone.
Yeah, take your time.
Sorry. Apologies about that.
No
All right. I appreciate a fourth wall being broken as the next person. So what I wanted to do is to, in some ways, trouble the link between the idea of the American soldier as always being viewed as a figure of honor and patriotism, by in many ways thinking about the way in which those notions of patriotism and honor historically have actually been very racialized concepts. And within the U.S. military itself, the history of African Americans serving, there's been a moment in which many Black people have actually, instead of serving as soldiers fighting, have actually been part of laboring units. And I wanted to think through what that meant in terms of how people began to discuss their own understandings about patriotism, their own service, especially when we're thinking about forms of honor itself, as you are more honorable depending on the kind of work or position you have in the U.S. military. So in terms of officers leading men and women to battle, people being frontline soldiers, you often have African Americans historically working in service units. And for many reasons, I would say both in terms of, let's say, hagiographies of military service, you see, we spend a lot of time in terms of African American literature in history talking about the Tuskegee Airmen as a representation of excellence, particularly black manhood. But I wanted to recover some of these other stories of the folks who labored and begin to think about how they understood patriotism, honor, and forms of freedom and bondage. And I would say that another reason why military worker became important was in some ways to signal to progressive, leftist, radical scholars and activists to get a sense of ways of thinking, of reconceiving their relationship to the U.S. military. And what I mean by this is that something that in my acknowledgments is that I myself grew up in the U.S. In a military family, and when I began to do research on this topic, I began to realize that progressive leftist institutions have a robust critique of the U.S. military, and that is fine. But I was also wondering, how do you actually speak to the people within the military and to see the work that they do? So in some ways, I'm hoping that thinking of soldiers not as only those folks who are carrying on, let's say, American imperialism through through bayonets and other forms of violence, but also seeing them as laborers, as workers. I wonder if that might actually move progressive scholars to really open up the way in which they think about the military and those who serve this global apparatus.
You know, your book shows how African-American military service overseas produced new notions of racial affiliation and animated particular lines of scientific and medical racism. And you do so by emphasizing the concepts of immunity and contagion. Your dissection of immunity, I thought particularly, and its multivalence was just fascinating and helpful for thinking through the paradox of why African Americans continue to fight for a country that denies them their rights in civilian life. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, as well as the ways in which immunity and contagion operate in your study and scaffold the history that you lay out in the book.
Sure. Immunity is an interesting term that I found within the materials that I researched, and I'd say that when we think of immunity today, we might think about the immunity that we receive after chickenpox, or we think about it in terms of diplomatic immunity, or the kinds of immunities that we're currently talking about with police officers in terms of what does it mean, can they be charged for certain crimes. And what I learned is that the term immunity has an older use within African American discourse, particularly the mid to late 19th century, and immunity as a synonym for rights and privileges of citizenship. And this is a term that actually comes directly from the 14th Amendment, and from the first sentence: "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." And so we often think about the 14th Amendment as being the Equal Protection Clause. And I wanted to think about immunity as this multivalent term. So one of the things that also that occurs with African Americans serving during the Spanish-Cuban American War is that there were fears that yellow fever would decimate American troops. And so the U.S. military began to enlist African American men and women to serve in immune regiments. And so for the men, those who served in immune regiments were believed to be immune to yellow fever. And that immunity would allow them to serve in places that, quite frankly, some white soldiers refused to. And the fever fields in Santiago, and hospitals that were overwhelmed with yellow fever, and also needing people to bury the dead. Large numbers of people who were dying from yellow fever. And as we'll talk about black women in a bit, but black women also were hired by the U.S. military during that war in 1898 in order to serve as care workers in the hospitals as nurses. And so those two ideas of immunity I try to hold on to, both in terms of immunity as a synonym for rights and privileges of citizenship, but also the way in which it in some ways gestures towards a kind of embodied sacrifice of black military subjects and black military workers. So the way in which immunity relates to contagion is that as we move through the 20th century, we begin to see that the immune body, viewed by the U.S. military in terms of African Americans, began to be seen as a contagious body and a body in need of regulation. And so the contagion of Contagions of Empire refers to the way in which often white military officers were surveilling and regulating the behaviors of mostly African American men. And this involves anxieties around interracial sex, but it also involves forms of medical experimentation on black soldiers as well that happened during World War I and were reprised during World War II. And so bringing immunity and contagion together gave me another way of reading this archive. And for me, what has been exciting is that I did not anticipate these two terms coming out of my analysis. I mean, what I can say that when I began this work, I thought that I would write a racial and gendered history of African American soldiers. And what happened is once I began to assemble these materials, I saw that another story was emerging. And so the idea of finding within African American newspapers in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries references to immunity in terms of the notion of political immunity. What forms of a political immunity will we receive as a community based upon our heroic service and sacrifice in imperial war? Seeing that question written by African American journalists was powerful for me, and it changed the way in which I began to listen to the stories in the archive.
That's great. One of the things that you note up front, you gestured to it just a moment ago, is kind of the distinctly gendered character of the archives that you relied on for this work, and the importance that intersectional analysis plays in your research. Can you elaborate on this a little bit more and discuss the ways in which Black feminist thought particularly opens new horizons of consideration when grappling with the history of Black military service abroad?
Yes. In so many ways, I feel that my project moved on from its dissertation stage when I began to look for information about Black women who served in the Spanish-American War. And within that, I looked towards the work of Black feminist historians like Darlene Clark Hine, and I used their insights to begin to question how do we tell a gendered and racialized history of African American service abroad? And so I began to think about how intersectionality is not only something that will allow us to tell a story about Black womanhood, though this is something that I try to do within the Spanish-Cuban American War, but those ideas I think are also very important for us to perhaps reassess the histories of American militarism that we already know exist, And so one of the things I tried to argue is that these archives that I study are in many ways male patterned. And so many, if not most, of the theorists that I treat within the book are men. And I think that that's not necessarily a problem, but beginning to think about the gendered ways in which Black masculinity as well as Black womanhood were mobilized by the U.S. military became a new avenue for me to reassess these histories. It also allowed me to try to find stories that were not in the public record. And I think that that's something that I really do learn a lot from Black feminist thought in terms of trying to get a sense of what stories were meant to be public and what stories were meant to be private. And so that is one of the ways in which Black feminism has really helped me to conceive of different military histories in the early to mid 20th century.
Fantastic. You know, your book recovers and recounts the history of the immune nurses that you discussed before and their service during the Spanish-Cuban-American War. And it focuses attention on Yamaoka Curtis, who played a critical role in recruiting women across the country, many of them Black women, to nurse soldiers, as you mentioned, who were sick with yellow fever. And I know it's a large subject, but can you offer the broad strokes of this story, the ways in which it connects to the history of American slavery, and how the experiences of these women disrupts our typically white supremacist histories of the Spanish-American War?
Sure. I mean, and this is what, the Spanish-American War is in some ways a war that is skipped over. I think that when many people are writing about the service of African Americans and looking at the paradox between people fighting for their own freedom and recognition as full citizens within America, we often skip over that war. And what I found is that that war actually was the first time that African American women were offered a role by the military to work as nurses overseas. And that was really fascinating. And so in order to marshal these women together, the U.S. military relied on the expertise and in many ways the spunk of Yamaoka Curtis. Yamaoka Curtis was a self-declared African American or a Black woman, and it's important to note that because by today's standards, we might say that she was a mixed race woman, a woman of color, and her own racial and ethnic identity involved Native ancestry as well as African and German. But she was someone who really believed in Black progress through embrace of patriotism and selfless service. And so her husband was the director of the Freedmen's Hospital in D.C., and she was really well known socially, and she herself was a nurse. And so she was contacted by the U.S. military and asked if she could help mobilize nurses. And so she left D.C. and went down to New Orleans and really began to go to local churches asking if Black women could actually would be interested in serving abroad, because yellow fever at that time was beginning to make its impact upon Black soldiers in Cuba. And how this relates to slavery, I think, is, to me, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of the study of what I discovered, but was also there, I guess, if anyone had taken the time to look at it, is that some of the women who actually served as immune nurses had served as nurses during the Civil War. And this was an interesting moment of looking at how there was sort of older nurses as well as newer nurses who were trained in some of the newer nursing schools. And at this time, these nursing schools were segregated. And so you had a mix of older women, younger women, who all signed up in order to serve overseas. And I think that another aspect of how this relates to slavery is the fact that there was a discourse around using black womanhood in order to treat yellow fever. And this is something that is in a lot of the 19th century scientific literature. The ways in which the idea that during plantation outbreaks in the South, many doctors believed that you needed a black woman. They often used the language of the mammy to indicate that you needed black women to clean and to treat and to save the plantation proper. And so those ideas, though we are talking about 1898, those ideas were very much in the minds of military officials, because we're in a moment in which the vector of yellow fever has not been discovered, at least by American doctors at this time. It wouldn't really be accepted by American doctors until around 1901, 1902, 1903. And so in this moment, you have black womanhood as in some ways being this magical, mystical force that we don't quite know why black women are necessary to treating yellow fever, but we just know that black women work. And so that is thinking about the history of black womanhood used in this way was helpful in terms of seeing the way in which black women were treated, both in the field in Cuba and also when they came back home. And I think that was one of the painful aspects of the story for me, is finding out that after black women had served so loyally, they experienced segregation and racist treatment on their way home, in terms of what it meant for them to take trains and having their trains turned into the colored car. And so this was fascinating, and I was shocked myself that I had never heard of this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The part of the book where you recount some of the stories that were told about their journey back were shocking, frankly, and something I had certainly never heard of before. But to pivot to sort of another part of your narrative for a moment, you also retell the history of Charles Young, who might be the most pronounced embodiment of the paradox of black military service. Among other things, he was a soldier, he was a linguist, a cartographer, and a playwright, whose ideas about race and militarism you chart in the book, and which sort of changed radically over the years. And I really loved this part of the book, and I recommend it to everybody, because you organize your discussion of Young's career and his political evolution in 5 acts, and which mirrors the structure of his play or homage to his hero, Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary. And I'm wondering if you could I've got so many questions about this, but I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about how you arrived at this approach, what advantages you found in sort of filtering Young's story through the prism of theatrical performance, and specifically his dramatic treatment of Toussaint.
This was, I would say, the hardest chapter to write, both because I have to really give a shout out to my research assistant, Brian Zayat, because I gave an assignment to look up some certain ideas around Charles Young in a online archive, and all of a sudden he says, "Well, do you know that he apparently wrote this play about Toussaint?" And so the reason why I settled on the 5-act framework for this story was because I was very influenced by Saidiya Hartman's essay Venus in 2 Acts, and thinking about ways in which we can, the kinds of stories that we actually can pull out of the archive. And one of the things I think it's probably a larger argument I'm trying to make, is that some of the things that I find aren't hidden, right? So it's just they just have been blatantly ignored, and so it shocks me to know that that I'm not sure that anyone has written much or anything about Charles Young's play about Toussaint Louverture, who had always been a hero to him, an actual idol, and so I wanted to think about his life as a study in performance. So the idea that his father served in the Civil War, himself was enslaved. The fact that Young then goes to, I mean, he just becomes this anomaly in terms of how he was treated by his white superiors, how he was treated by white soldiers, and also the ways in which he treated his African American troops that were under his command. And so I would say that the most amazing thing about his personal career to me was that he was the first military attaché, American military attaché in Haiti. And this happened in 1904. And this became an amazing assignment for him because in some ways it became a research sabbatical. And he began to learn more about voodoo as a religion, at least in terms of how he understood the religion. And he began to do research on a play about Toussaint Louverture. And so I used the framework of that play in order to try to thread the strands of his life. And that play itself is really, I would call it a tragedy, but a tragedy among other Black radical tragedies. And so the fact that this was a play that he worked on for about 15 or 16 years, and he finished it when he was stationed in Liberia, about 2 years before he died in 1920. That version of the play has been lost to history, but the version that we have access to, he wrote in 1910. So there's a way in which the play itself has a kind of prophetic quality in terms of the kind of betrayal that Young himself would experience. So one of the reasons why Young was so invested in the legacy of Toussaint Louverture is because he saw him as a Black general. And Young had mentioned to many people that he wanted to be the first Black general within the U.S. Armed Forces. And he did everything right. He was obedient. He understood that the work he was doing was for both race and for country. But on the eve of World War I, this person who was fluent in French and German was told that he was unfit to not only he was unfit to serve in France because of a heart condition, and this was something that he was very frustrated and did everything he could to prove that he was able, and he rode a horse from Ohio to Washington D.C., which the African American press was so excited about. And they really wanted him to be this icon of Black manhood and patriotic masculinity. But that didn't change the decision that had been made. A decision that other scholars have worked to argue that this was in fact a racist way of stopping him from being able to serve in France. For the simple idea that white officers and white soldiers would not agree with having a Black man in such a prominent role, and so that betrayal is a betrayal that he, in some ways, writes about in his play on about Toussaint Louverture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to look at intertwine those ideas together to think about these two men as icons that really wanted a kind of approval from their national societies. So Toussaint really wanted Napoleon's approval and really saw himself as a subject of the French crown, and was betrayed. And this was a similar betrayal that occurred to Young himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another. This is a little bit beyond, I think, the scope of your study, but one of the things you do bring up and talk about is Young's relationship with Du Bois, and I'm wondering to what degree did each man sort of influence the emerging kind of political beliefs of the other? Can you speak to that at all?
It's interesting. What I find fascinating about Du Bois and Young's friendship is that they met early on in their careers in the late 19th century. They both worked at Wilberforce University, and I think that in many ways, I think that Du Bois was probably reluctant to admit it, but I think that Du Bois got a lot of insight for his theory about double consciousness in terms of watching a Charles Young attempt to be accepted by the white military elite, and watching him being rejected from being part of the American body of officers, and so I think that also Du Bois, and I think it's interesting to think about Du Bois as someone who we understand as a radical. We often think about the later period of his life when he becomes an expatriate. But I think that he learned a lot from Charles Young. He saw Charles Young stationed in Liberia twice. They worked together in terms of Du Bois's musicals. Charles Young also was a musician. Wrote music for some of Du Bois's shows, and I think that they really influenced one another. I know that Young really wanted to. Young saw himself as a polyglot, in much like Du Bois was, right? And that relationship between two African American men really being at the top of their game in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I think it's something that really that impacted Du Bois for the rest of his life, or at least until the end of World War II. One of the things that Du Bois famously wrote in the crisis in World War I was his Closed Ranks editorial, where he urged African Americans to, in some ways, to, for the moment, forget their grievances with white America in order to come together and fight a common foe. That was something that it created lots of consternation within the NAACP leadership, and there were also ideas that Du Bois himself was attempting to serve and with military intelligence division as well. But during World War II, let's say younger activists were in some ways dismissive of Du Bois for these earlier stances about embracing American militarism. And Du Bois, he didn't shy away from his earlier work, and in fact, he actually stood by it even more. And so perhaps Du Bois, after World War II, and it became clear that serving on behalf of the United States was not giving African Americans the political immunity that they sought. That may have had an impact upon Du Bois's decision to leave the United States altogether.
Mm-hmm. You know, as your story progresses through time, I was really taken with your discussion of black servicemen in World War I, and the ways in which they negotiated what you refer to as dangerous pleasures. And this part of the book kind of goes into territory that was completely unexpected to me as it went on. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how militarized discourses of pleasure and danger during this period grafted onto the larger context in which masculinity, sexuality, and the venereal health of black military workers take center stage.
Yes, this was. It's sort of shocking to see what you discover in the archive. And what I found out is that that during World War I, that there had been certain doctors from Johns Hopkins who became officers in France, and that they themselves believed they were in fact urologists. So Hugh Hampton Young, who's known today as the father of American urology, and David Walker. They believed that in order for the U.S. military to be successful in World War I, that the military needed to be the cleanest army in the world, and cleanliness here refers to the notion of sexually transmitted infections or diseases, and with that in mind, they adopted a technique for a kind of venereal prophylaxis from New Zealand doctors that involved injecting silver compounds into the urethra, and then using mercury chloride as an exterior salve in order to make sure that venereal infections did not take place. What's important to note here is that Young, or Hugh Hampton Young, was not in favor of African Americans having any kind of romantic or sexual relations with French women, and that he was very angry about it. And so it turned out that African Americans who served often as dock workers, stevedores in France, were seen as very sexually active, and so these the prophylaxis that he prescribed, initially this was supposed to be something that was an elective, that if you thought that you actually had a sexual encounter, hurry up, and take the prophylaxis, and then go about your day. But it was also known that the prophylaxis was extremely painful. And so it's pretty clear that African Americans were being tortured every time, at least stevedores in certain regions of France, when they left the base and came back on, there was an assumption that they had gone off base in order to have sex with a French woman. And so this was a way of regulating the sexuality of black soldiers. And so in some ways, I think that's where the danger comes from, the idea of seeing black men as these venereal bodies that needed to be regulated and surveilled and punished in order to stop them from crossing the color line. At the same time, it was the idea of African Americans, African American men in this context, as leaving the United States and seeing a new world of possibility that really, in some ways, I think signifies on the notion of contagion in terms of how they interacted and the new situation they found themselves in. And so I think that there is pleasure both in terms of a kind of sexual pleasure that they were part of, but there was also pleasure in seeing themselves as not only desiring subjects, but also desired subjects. And so when you look at certain military bands, I think most prominent among them, the Harlem Hellfighters, as they traveled France, they brought jazz to France, and that I think was one of the ways in which I saw that the narrative was not only a narrative of, let's say, Black violation, but it was also a narrative of Black possibility. And I think that is something that became a narrative that led other African American men and women into the service as we move from World War I, past World War II, into our contemporary era.
Great. We've actually got a question from the audience, and that has to do with your referencing to the archives. You've mentioned being surprised by what you found, and the question is sort of, I guess, a couple parts to it. One is, what archives did you rely on for your research? How did you know where to look, and what surprised you the most?
Wow, that's a very good question. I think I began my work mostly in newspaper archives, and it's interesting to think about digitization and the digital humanities in this context, because digitized newspaper archives were so central to my work and very helpful in terms of allowing me to look for certain terms. So I would say that that seeing how many times the term immunity was used in African American newspapers from 1895 to 1923, that was something that was very, very helpful. I'll also say it's some people, I've heard groans when I say this, but Ancestry.com was really helpful for me, especially in terms of thinking through the chapter on Black nurses and reconstructing the lineage of Namioka Curtis. And one of the reasons that was so important is that within the archive itself, Curtis's own racial identification shifted about every 10 years or so. Depending on who her family members were at the time, everyone seemed to be racialized with the same brush. So as a child, her parents died when she was relatively young. She lived with her grandmother in San Francisco, and then she was seen as white, right? But then about the next census, she has a Black family, she's seen as Black, but 10 years later after that, she's seen as mulatto. And so that, I think, so Ancestry.com was really important. Early on in some of the work, I did some research in Berlin, and that at Staatsbibliothek was helpful. Also, I'm forgetting there's a museum in Berlin that I'm losing right now. But I think that I really just tried to think differently about what I would find in the archive, and that helped me piece together a different story. And so, and I love archival research. For me, I would say that my relationship to the archive was stimulated through when I lived in New York City. I was blessed to know a number of DJs, and the ways in which DJs reconstruct narratives in their sets was a really important learning tool for me, both in terms of how I began to dig and learning how to dig differently, but then also trying to listen to the song itself. Or the narrative itself, and seeing how I can reconstruct a narrative around certain breaks, especially when you only have fragments to go on. I'll say one of the things that was really helpful was for a long time I didn't know Namioka Curtis's first name, because one of the things that I learned was that she was always known as Mrs. A.M. Curtis or Mrs. Curtis. And in the 19th century, it was common for women of social fame to use their husband's name in public. And so it took me some time before I could actually sort of find out, that, the person, I thought her name was perhaps Anna Mae Curtis, was in fact using her husband's name, Austin. And so it's been interesting to, and I'll say that also Fold 3 has been an important resource for military research as well.
You close the book with an examination of black soldiers in the Second World War. And on the one hand, you recount the ways in which they continue to be subject to exclusion and scientifically racist beliefs about contagion. But you also look at how narratives began to emerge during this period, which suggests that overseas military service offered African Americans a degree of freedom that was denied to them at home. Narratives that you argue influenced the ways in which African Americans subsequently considered enlistment. Can you unpack for us how these narratives sort of took hold in the ways in which they laid what you call the mythic foundation for believing that military service provided a breath of freedom for African American men and women?
Yes, I think that that in some ways is a narrative that I think it's very it's close to home to me in terms of what it meant for me to be a child of an African American military family that spent much of my father's career abroad growing up, but also understanding that the belief that African American soldiers, especially after World War II, began to think of service outside of the United States as a breath of freedom. I think that General Colin Powell helped to popularize that notion, but he himself, understood that, post World War II, when he was stationed in Germany in the 1950s. So it became interesting for me to think about service outside of the United States as being understood as a breath of freedom, even while black soldiers were still being regulated and surveilled by white military police or white officers while they were overseas. And so I wanted to, in some ways, challenge that idea a bit. In fact, actually, there is a great book on black soldiers in Germany, Maria Hoon, and I forget her co-author, but it's called A Breath of Freedom. And so I think that in fact is I think that those narratives are important, but I did want to destabilize the idea that things were so free. And I wanted to sort of look at the fact of how folks began to embrace this narrative and to seek it out, and the times that they actually believed that it was true, but also the times when it wasn't a breath of freedom as well.
Yeah. So we are beginning to run out of time, unfortunately. But before we go, though it lies mostly beyond the boundaries of your study, I'm wondering if you can comment on the ways in which the lineages of immunity and contagion that you trace throughout the book can be seen in considerations of black military workers today and the maintenance of American empire, both at home and abroad.
I think that that there's. I have to say that I've been really shocked, really sort of shocked into silence at how much the U.S. military is part of contemporary discourse. I can say that having worked on this book for about 10 years, that I don't really expect people to think about the U.S. military other than just a critique of militarism or an embrace of patriotism. Today, I've been shocked at sometimes what I would sort of think about the afterlives of slavery being a part of the U.S. military in terms of the low numbers of African American officers operating in combat squadrons across the branches of the U.S. military. The instances of racism at West Point that people continue to sort of talk about and talk through. So today, I guess it's been and while that is true, I also think that the idea that African Americans continue to, I think, move beyond the paradoxical relationship that they have with the U.S. military. I think that often when we think about the paradox of how could African Americans serve a country that does not love them or give them the kind of respect that they hoped, that we see that as something that cannot be resolved. And yet there is an entire tradition of African Americans actually not being stuck by that paradox. That they in fact understand that they are fighting for something, whether it's patriotism, whether it is a kind of economic investment, a kind of, a sense of moving up the economic ladder. I think that there are a number of reasons in which people actually serve in the U.S. military. And what I wanted to do is to think about how can, let's say, organizations such as the Black Veterans Project, who are attempting to make inroads, investments within African American soldiers and veterans today, how can I help them with a longer history that helps them understand that there's a genealogy of not only Black military service, but Black military thought. And I think that that's what I've been shocked to see, that some of the things that I wrote that I found from over 100 years ago are still and still seem to be important to our contemporary conversations today.
Yeah. Dr. Khary Polk, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon. And thank you to everybody that's been watching this conversation out there in the internet during this pandemic. We really appreciate you also giving us your time. And I encourage everybody to go out and buy Dr. Polk's book, which again is called Contagions of Empire: Scientific Racism, Sexuality, and Black Military Workers Abroad, 1898 to 1948. It's well worth the read. It's excellent. So, Dr. Polk, thank you again. We really appreciate it, and be safe and be well.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.